Australia has a housing crisis that most people frame as a capital city problem. Sydney median prices above 1.5 million. Melbourne not far behind. Brisbane and Perth accelerating so fast that the people who left for cheaper ground 5 years ago can no longer afford to return. The standard advice is to wait, to save harder, to find a guarantor, to accept a longer commute. What that advice consistently fails to mention is that there is another Australia entirely. This is not that video. This is the other conversation. Because scattered across the interior of this continent, in the red dust country beyond the bitumen, there are things that should not exist. Not cheap houses. Something older than that. Something that the geology, the archaeology, and the oral history traditions of the oldest continuous culture on Earth cannot yet fully account for. 13 of them, to be precise. 13 formations of ancient stone in the landscape around Alice Springs that researchers have documented, that traditional custodians have spoken about in careful and specific terms, and that no current framework of explanation has satisfactorily resolved. Not one of the 13, not a single site on this list has a consensus explanation that satisfies the physical evidence on the ground. We are going to go through every one of them. What each site looks like, what is known, what has been proposed, and what the evidence actually supports when you hold the proposals against it directly. If you are the kind of person who stays until the end of something like this, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. The channel covers subjects that mainstream documentary production tends to treat too carefully to handle honestly. A like helps this reach people who would actually want to find it. Now, Alice Springs. The town sits in a gap in the MacDonnell Ranges, a spine of ancient quartzite and sandstone ridges that run east to west across the Northern Territory. The ranges are genuinely old. Not old in the way that a 19th century building is old. Old in the way that geologists use the word carefully because the numbers involved stop sounding like years and start sounding like abstractions. The quartzite formations in the East MacDonnells were laid down over 500 million years ago. The Aboriginal custodians of this country, primarily the Arltunga people, have lived in and around this landscape for a period that Western academic chronology continues to revise upward. Current peer-reviewed estimates place continuous human occupation of the Alice Springs region at somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years. For context, that is longer than modern humans have been in Europe. Longer than the pyramids by a factor of 10. Against that backdrop, the question of who built the stone formations around Alice Springs, and when and why, is not a question that yields to easy answers. The sites on this list have been examined by geologists, by archaeologists from multiple universities, by independent researchers, and by traditional custodians whose oral records extend further back than any written source on Earth. The honest answer across all 13 sites remains contested. That is where we begin. Site number 1, the arrangement at Owen Springs. Owen Springs Reserve sits south of Alice Springs, a protected pastoral property handed back to traditional custodians in 2003 and now managed jointly by Arltunga and Patame families with Parks and Wildlife Commission involvement. Within the reserve, on a flat shelf of ground above the Hugh River, there is a grouping of standing stones that has appeared in research correspondence between Australian National University geologists and the Northern Territory Heritage Office since at least the 1980s. The stones are not enormous. The tallest reaches approximately 1.8 meters. There are 31 of them in the currently documented section of the arrangement, and they appear to follow a deliberate spacing pattern. The intervals between stones, measured across multiple surveys, fall within a range that statisticians working on the site in 2004 described as inconsistent with random geological deposition. What it means in plain terms is that the spacing looks intentional. The geological assessment of the stones produced no surprises. The material is local quartzite consistent with the surrounding range geology. The stones did not come from elsewhere. But the question of how upright standing stones of this height came to be positioned in a flat alluvial plain without geological process to account for their vertical orientation has not been answered to the satisfaction of everyone who has looked closely. The Arltunga oral tradition associated with Owen Springs includes accounts of ancestral beings who shaped the landscape during the dreaming, a cosmological framework that should not be misread as mythology in the dismissive sense. It is a record system. The specific oral accounts connected to this area describe the arrangement in terms that suggest deliberate placement rather than natural formation. Reconciling that tradition with physical evidence and Western scientific method is a project that remains genuinely incomplete. Site number 2. The ring formation near Trephina Gorge. Trephina Gorge is one of the more visited sections of the East MacDonnell Ranges, known for its white ghost gum trees growing directly from red rock faces and the gorge pool that holds water year-round in defiance of the surrounding desert. Several kilometers from the main gorge visitor area, accessible by a track not signposted from the main road, there is a ring of stones sitting on elevated ground overlooking the valley below. The ring has an approximate diameter of 22 meters. The individual stones forming the perimeter range from half a meter to roughly 1.2 meters in height. An early survey conducted by a Northern Territory Museum researcher in 1991 noted that the interior of the ring contained a scatter of smaller stones in a pattern the researcher described as non-random, without being able to account for what process could have produced it. What makes Trephina interesting in the broader context of this list is the sightline. Standing at the center of the ring and looking south, the view aligns directly with a gap in the ranges that, on the winter solstice, frames the setting sun precisely at its descent below the ridgeline. That alignment was first documented by an amateur astronomer in 2007 and has been independently confirmed twice since. Whether it is a deliberate astronomical feature or a coincidence of placement and topography is exactly the kind of question this list is filled with. Site number 3. The linear stones at Emily Gap. Emily Gap, known in Arltunga tradition as Undoolya, is one of the most significant sacred sites in the Alice Springs region. It is a site of the caterpillar dreaming, and the ochre paintings inside the gap have been documented by multiple researchers over the past century. The site is protected, respected, and genuinely not a location where casual excavation or removal of material is considered or permitted. On the approach to the gap from the western side, running roughly parallel to the path of the Todd River, there is a line of stones extending for approximately 140 meters. The stones sit flush with or just above the ground surface. They are not dramatically upright, but they form a consistent straight line across country that geologically has no obvious structural reason to produce a straight surface feature. The local geology runs in curves and arcs, shaped by ancient water and tectonic folding. Straight lines are not what this landscape makes naturally. The linear arrangement at Emily Gap has been examined in the context of research into what some archaeologists describe as pathway markers in the Australian landscape. The idea that stone lines were used to delineate ceremonial routes or mark navigational paths across country is not fringe speculation. There is documented evidence of this practice from multiple Australian regions. What makes the Emily Gap line notable is its length, its consistency, and its proximity to one of the most significant sacred sites in the region. Site number 4. The concentric rings at Heavitree Gap. Heavitree Gap is the entry point to Alice Springs from the south, the natural break in the MacDonnell Ranges through which the Stuart Highway passes. It is also one of the most ceremonially significant gaps in Arltunga tradition, a place whose importance in the spiritual and territorial structure of the landscape cannot be overstated. On the eastern wall of the gap, above the waterline of the Todd River, there is a section of flat rock face bearing a series of concentric carved rings. These are not paintings. They are incised into the stone itself. The outermost ring measures approximately 60 centimeters in diameter. There are 4 rings total, each interior to the last, each carved to a consistent depth that weathering analysis suggests took place over multiple periods rather than in a single event. Concentric ring motifs are among the most widely distributed forms of rock art and ground marking in Australia. They appear in Western desert art traditions in stylized form. They appear as ground designs at ceremony sites. What makes the Heavitree Gap rings unusual is not their existence, but their 3-dimensional relief cutting into stone, and the evidence of multi-period construction across what may be an extremely long time frame. Site number 5. The alignment on Mount Undoolya. Mount Undoolya sits southeast of Alice Springs Town Centre, a quartzite ridge offering views across the Todd River Valley and toward the East McDonald's. On its southern slope, a series of stones has been placed in an arrangement running for approximately 60 meters across the hillside at a consistent angle to the slope. What makes Undoolya remarkable is a survey conducted in 2012 by a researcher from Flinders University examining potential astronomical alignments in the Alice Springs region. The survey found that the arrangement on Mount Undoolya extended as a line of bearing across the landscape, pointed directly toward the rising position of the star Canopus on the night of the autumn equinox. Canopus is the second brightest star in the southern sky and holds significant navigational and ceremonial importance in multiple Aboriginal astronomical traditions across Australia. The response within the research community has been appropriately cautious. Astronomical alignments can be found if you look for them, and the confirmation bias problem in archaeoastronomy is well documented. The Undoolya result has not been published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it also has not been refuted. The bearing is what the bearing is, and Canopus rises where it rises. Site number 6. The Sunken Circle at Ross River. The Ross River region east of Alice Springs has been a station homestead and tourist destination for decades. What is less advertised is a feature approximately 3 kilometers from the homestead on country within a pastoral lease boundary. There, in a cleared section of mulga scrub, the ground describes a perfect circle roughly 18 meters in diameter, where the soil surface sits approximately 30 centimeters below the level of the surrounding terrain. This depression is not explained by geological sinkholes, which are not a feature of this type of substrate. It is not explained by water erosion, which would not produce a circular feature of this regularity in this topographic position. An early investigation by a pastoral lands officer in the 1970s described it simply as unusual and referred it to the Museum of Central Australia without follow-up documentation that has since been located. The Arltunga name for the general area translates in the limited published record to a term associated with gathering and meeting. What is established is that the feature exists, that it is geometrically regular, that no current explanation accounts for its formation, and that several people who have examined it professionally have left without a satisfying answer. Site number 7. The Double Row at Arltunga. Arltunga Historical Reserve, about 100 kilometres northeast of Alice Springs, preserves the remains of Central Australia's first gold rush settlement from the 1890s. The ghost town infrastructure, the assay office, the stone-walled ruins of the government works camp are documented, interpreted, and presented to visitors with reasonable completeness. What is not part of the interpretive signage is a double row of stones on a ridgeline approximately 2 kilometres northwest of the main historical precinct. The rows run parallel to each other, separated by roughly 3 meters, and extend for about 80 meters before the stone pattern becomes unclear. The individual stones in each row are set at intervals of approximately 1 meter. the construction is consistent enough across the full documented length to rule out the variability you would expect from natural rock tumbling in a landscape that does not experience freeze-thaw cycles. The Arltunga double rows exist in a zone where 19th century European activity is documented extensively. The possibility of construction by the gold rush population cannot be dismissed, but no historical record of the rows has been located in the station journals, survey records, or correspondence of the period. If European settlers built them, they did not write it down anywhere that has survived. Site number 8. The scattered complex at Standley Chasm. Standley Chasm, known in Arrernte tradition as Undoolya, is one of the most photographed locations in the Northern Territory. The narrow slot canyon reaches its most dramatic state at midday when direct sunlight reaches the canyon floor, and the orange walls glow with an intensity that photographs badly and real life handles well. It is managed by the Iwapataka Land Trust, and entry fees go directly to the traditional custodian community. Beyond the main chasm and away from the visitor trail, in country that requires permission and a custodian escort to access appropriately, there is a complex of stone arrangements described in limited published literature as the most extensive in the Alice Springs region. Researchers who have visited describe elements including what appear to be concentric rings, short linear segments, and isolated standing stones across an area of several hectares. The Standley Chasm complex has not been the subject of a systematic academic survey. The access requirements and the sensitivity of the site in terms of traditional law have meant that it sits in the research literature as a known unknown, referenced in footnotes but never examined with the thoroughness the scale of the site seems to warrant. Site number 9. The Waterstones at Ellery Creek. Ellery Creek Big Hole is a permanent water hole in the West McDonald's, one of the most reliable water sources in the entire range system, and a site of obvious importance to any human population moving through this landscape across thousands of years. The stones in question are not at the waterhole itself. They are upstream on a flat section of creek bed that is dry for most of the year, approximately 2 kilometers from the main swimming area. Here, arranged across the flat stone bed of the dry creek, there are a series of upright stones and cairn formations that have been photographed by visitors and reported to Parks and Wildlife over a period of at least 3 decades. The consistency of their vertical placement in a creek bed where flood events regularly redistribute rock material raises an obvious question about how they remained standing, and a less obvious question about how they came to be standing in the first place. One hypothesis, presented informally in a park submission from the early 2000s, is that the formations are reconstructed after each flood event by community members maintaining a feature of ongoing ceremonial significance. This would explain their persistence without requiring them to be ancient in construction, though it would require them to be ancient in design. Site number 10. The grid pattern at Heavitree. Heavitree sits roughly 200 kilometers north of Alice Springs on the Stuart Highway. The stone arrangement associated with Heavitree is not in the immediate community area. It is accessed from a station track running east from the highway, approximately 40 kilometers north of the community turnoff, on country that requires permission from the relevant traditional custodians to visit. The arrangement has been described as a grid. That word should be used carefully because the feature is not a precise geometric grid in any mechanical sense. What researchers who have seen it describe is a series of stone rows running in 2 approximate directions broadly perpendicular to each other, creating a pattern of enclosed areas that, from an elevated vantage point, resembles a grid more than it resembles anything geological process typically produces. Ground grids with perpendicular elements are documented in Aboriginal Australia in specific contexts connected to ceremony and land management. The Brew Arena fish traps in New South Wales represent the kind of large-scale stoneworking project that Australian Aboriginal communities were capable of across very long time periods. The tie tree arrangement has not been formally excavated, and its age has not been determined. Site number 11. The Mound Rings at Palmer River. The Palmer River region, southeast of Alice Springs, in country associated with Arrernte and Luritja custodianship, contains a feature type that appears occasionally in the documentation of this region, but has not been comprehensively catalogued. These are mound rings, low circular earth and stone features, where material has been raised around a perimeter to create a slightly elevated ring with a lower interior. The Palmer River examples number at least 7 in the documented record, distributed across an area of roughly 3 square kilometers. They range from approximately 4 meters to 12 meters in diameter. The raised perimeters are low, rarely exceeding 30 centimeters of elevation above the interior surface, and they have eroded considerably from whatever their original profile was. The honest description of mound rings in the Central Australian literature is that their function is disputed, their age is generally unknown, and they appear in contexts that suggest human construction without the kind of associated material record that allows confident interpretation. Comparisons have been drawn to similar features documented in Papua New Guinea and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Whether those comparisons represent meaningful connection or coincidental similarity is a question that no current research program has funded to a definitive answer. Site number 12. The Radial Formation at Glen Helen. Glen Helen Gorge in the west. McDonald's is a permanent waterhole where the Finke River, one of the oldest river systems on Earth, passes through a break in the quartzite ranges. The landscape around Glen Helen has been important to Arrernte people across all documented periods, and the oral history connected to it is among the richest in the region. On the approach to Glen Helen from the east, on a gentle rise above the floodplain, there is a radial formation of stones extending outward from a central point in a pattern of lines rather than a complete circle. Imagine a wheel with spokes but without the rim. The central point is marked by a larger stone surrounded by a small cairn. The radiating lines extend outward at irregular intervals, but are individually consistent in their direction. Radial ground features are documented in parts of Aboriginal Australia in specific ceremonial contexts. The Glen Helen example is notable for its scale, for the central marker, and for the degree of preservation that suggests either relatively recent construction or active maintenance across a long period. The feature sits within a zone of high cultural significance where visitor access is managed carefully, which has limited systematic survey. Site number 13. The Outer Ring at Rainbow Valley. Rainbow Valley Conservation Reserve sits about 100 kilometers south of Alice Springs in the James Range, best known for its sandstone bluffs ranging from deep red to cream to yellow in horizontal bands shaped over millions of years. At the right time of day, usually late afternoon, when the light comes horizontal and low across the desert, the valley produces colors that photography never quite captures. There is, at a location within the reserve, away from the main interpretive trail, a large and roughly circular arrangement of stones on flat ground below the main bluff line. This is the 13th and most recently formally documented site on this list, brought to the attention of Northern Territory Heritage staff in 2018 by a ranger who had worked in the reserve for over a decade. She noticed the feature while conducting a post-flood ground inspection after an unusually heavy wet season had altered the surface vegetation enough to make the stone pattern visible from an angle that normal vegetation cover obscured. The arrangement at Rainbow Valley is approximately 30 meters in diameter at its widest point. It is not a complete or perfectly preserved circle. Sections of the perimeter are missing or disrupted, possibly by the same water events that made the visible sections accessible in 2018. But where the arrangement is intact, the stone placement is deliberate in a way that the ranger described in her report to heritage staff as impossible to mistake for natural. Heritage staff visited, photographs were taken. Arltunga custodians connected to the area were consulted and confirmed awareness of the feature in terms that indicated long-standing cultural knowledge of its existence rather than surprise at its discovery. A formal assessment was recommended. Whether that assessment has since been funded and conducted is not established in publicly available documentation. 13 sites. One landscape, a community of people whose relationship to that landscape stretches back further than almost any human relationship to any place on Earth. The pattern across all 13 of these locations is not that they are inexplicable in the sense of being beyond all rational framework. It is that they are unexplained in the specific sense that no current explanation has been validated against the physical evidence and held up to scrutiny. Geological process does not account for the regular spacing at Owen Springs. Coincidence is insufficient explanation for the astronomical alignment at Undoolya. The absence of any historical record undermines the European construction hypothesis at Arltunga. What these sites share is that they are real. They exist in the landscape. Researchers have stood at them, measured them, photographed them, and left with more questions than they arrived with. Traditional custodians hold knowledge about many of them that the published literature has only partially accessed and partially understood. The Alice Springs region does not need manufactured mystery. The actual documented history of human occupation across this landscape, the astronomical knowledge embedded in oral tradition, the scale of stoneworking evident at sites across the continent, all of that is extraordinary enough without embellishment. What the 13 sites on this list represent is an honest gap in the formal record. Things that exist and have not been adequately explained. Places that deserve careful, respectful, well-resourced investigation that the significance of this landscape has always warranted and has not consistently received. If you made it this far, subscribe. The channel will keep going further into the places and subjects that deserve more honest attention than they tend to get. The next video is on screen now.